Hello and welcome! In this video, we're going to show you how to quickly create a cluster in vSphere by using vCenter Server's relatively new Cluster Quickstart wizard. With the Cluster Quickstart wizard, we can very quickly create a cluster that has all of the features that you might possibly need in your cluster with one simple process. It makes life a whole lot easier. It supports vSAN and vSphere high availability and the distributed resource scheduler. And it also makes sure that you've got all of the VM kernel ports necessary to communicate on that network as well. It helps you to build a distributed switch. It helps you to set up your data stores and everything that you might need. Let's go ahead and begin by creating a new cluster. We'll go to our data center here and we'll say new cluster. In this case, we're going to be building a vSAN based cluster. So I'm going to call this my vSAN cluster. And I'm going to turn on, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this stuff empty for right now. Okay. Because it says that these can be changed later in the cluster quick start workflow. So let's do nothing but create a cluster and give it a name to start off with. And immediately when you create a cluster, it takes you under configuration to the quick start, where we've got 3 steps. We've got the services that we want to select. We've got the hosts that we want to add to the cluster, and then we're going to configure all the network settings and the rest of the cluster services. Let's dive right in and start with the cluster basics. And we're back here. We're going to enable DRS, we're going to enable HA, and we're going to enable vSAN. Simple enough. Okay, a minute or two, or a second or two rather, it comes up. And now we're going to add some hosts to the cluster. The nice part about this is that it gives us a really nice and simple way to add hosts. So we're going to go ahead and add our first ESXi host. Now the host has to be up and running with at least a set of defaults, the VM kernel port for management and an IP address. So let's go ahead and do this. I've already got these in DNS. They are ready to go. I'll give it a username and password, and I'll add the other hosts as well. And I'll tell it to use the same credentials for all the hosts because I made my root credentials uniform. If your hosts happen to be a member of Active Directory, you can use those credentials as well. Okay. So we'll remove that last one there and we'll hit next. At this point, let's see, you're going to verify any certificates. We'll go ahead and verify that. We've got ESXi 7.0 installed. It's even got the model number of our ESXi hosts. If we expand these, we can see the networks that are there. We can see the data stores that are available on each of these hosts and so on. Okay. Now at this point, it says the hosts are going to enter maintenance mode before they move into the cluster. It says that if there are any VMs on those hosts, we should do something about that. We'll go ahead and do that. Okay. And we'll add these hosts. You can see immediately that it connects to the hosts, moves them into the cluster. We can expand this. They're still in maintenance mode, and it's working on some vSAN related issues. Let's continue and see what happens, and we'll speed up the video here while we wait. So far so good. We've got one warning on here, but you'll notice that it went through a full validation check. It talks about time synchronization, vSAN synchronization, software compatibility, compatibility against the hardware, the HCL for drivers and for ESXi and for firmware. It says here we've got a warning on the HCL database. What this does is an online check of VMware's hardware compatibility list. I happen to be running a beta version of of vCenter and ESXi version 7. And when the product is finally launched, this one will be able to be checked. Now in step 3, we're going to configure the cluster. This gives us an opportunity to configure all of the different features of the cluster, as well as VM kernel ports and all of the networking systems. It also allows us to build a vSAN data store. Now we can use configure a distributed switch now. Right? At this point, it gives you an opportunity to create a distributed switch, select VM kernel ports for vMotion and vSAN, which are the two that are actually required for vSAN, and select the physical adapters on your host that will be utilized by this distributed switch. I had pre-configured these, so these hosts are all set up on distributed switches. So I'm going to say that I want to select these networking settings later. They're already done. It'll find that as well. And now we can choose the features. So under HA, do we want to monitor host failures? Yes. Do we want to have admission control? Yes. How many host failures do we want to tolerate? Do we want to monitor virtual machines using VMware tools? Right? That's up to you. The default is to have that off. For DRS, what would you like the automation level to be? Manual, partially automated, or fully automated? What's the threshold you should set for migrations? Okay. For vSAN, we're going to choose a single site cluster, or we can do a stretched cluster if we wanted. Do we want to use encryption? And which KMS cluster would we use for our encryption keys? Okay. Do we want to enable deduplication and compression and fault domains? And do we want to support large-scale cluster support? Large-scale cluster support allows us to go beyond 32 nodes to 64 nodes in a vSAN cluster. Do we want to enable lockdown mode to ensure that our hosts cannot be managed outside of vCenter server, right? Keeping lockdown mode ensures that it's a single point of management for vCenter, and you don't lose track of any of your hosts if somebody should actually log in and manage them separately. Do we want to set up an NTP server? Always a good idea to synchronize time. Okay. Do we want to update our hosts to include upgrades for new ESXi versions as we choose to update? Do we want to enable enhanced vMotion compatibility? And at what CPU generation would we like to enable enhanced vMotion compatibility, right? Do you have an old set of CPUs? I actually do, right? So we can enable this so we can do a live vMotion on virtual machines from my vSAN systems to my older, that's not really R740 cluster, it's actually R710s. Okay, so you can enable EVC then, or you can enable it later. Now at this time, we're talking about vSAN, and we're going to create our disk groups on each of our ESXi hosts. So we need to choose on each of our ESXi hosts the cluster and caching tiers. So let's expand these to ensure that we're choosing the right disks. Okay, so I have 1 terabyte disks to use for capacity, and then I have 500 gig disks to use for caching. You can see that across my 4 hosts, I have a couple of different models of my 500 gig disks, but it has identified them properly. It's chosen to use these 500 gig disks as cache. It's chosen to use these 1 terabyte disks as capacity. And this was the automatic claiming of disks. I didn't have to do anything manually to choose this. It was intelligent enough to know what to do here. So we'll go ahead and say next. Okay. I do not need to use a proxy for the Customer Experience Improvement Program. This actually is a really nice program, and it allows us to utilize the data in that program for things like checking to make sure that our hosts are on the hardware compatibility lists. It allows us to check our hosts for for firmware updates and things like that. Okay, so we're ready to go. We're going to review the fact that we're going to leave lockdown mode disabled for now. We're going to set up an NTP server. We've got enhanced vMotion compatibility turned off. We've got all of our disks claimed. We've got DRS and we've got HA configured, and we finish. And a couple of minutes later, we actually have an entire vSAN cluster set up with all of the services that we need, all in one step. Pretty nice. As soon as this is done, it will take the host out of maintenance mode, and you'll be ready to run workloads on your cluster. We'll speed the process up and come back when it's finished. Okay. It appears now that my cluster is created, and we're noticing that it's giving us a warning about management network redundancy. It's always important to have two physical adapters set up for management so that in a cluster configured for HA, a failure in the management network does not cause a false positive for a host failure. Okay, we're going to go ahead and suppress these warnings for right now. It does it across all the hosts in the cluster. We'll update that real fast. But later we really should be adding a second physical adapter, whether it's a second VM kernel port or an active standby NIC team for the cluster. And it looks to me like we've got a cluster. Pretty good. And that was pretty fast for creating a cluster. Well, I hope this has been informative to you. Again, my name is Joe Cooper with VMware Education, and look forward to you on the flip side.